All right, welcome to Being the GM You Wish Your Players Were. And I'm Tammy Keyes. I am the convention coordinator for Evil Beagle Games. With me is Bill Keyes, Micheal Surbrook, Chaz Kemp, and James Fielder, also known as Pigeon. And I'm gonna let them introduce themselves. And Chaz, since you're unmuted, we'll start with you.
Very well. I'm Chaz Kemp. I am the art director for Evil Beagle Games. I'm also an illustrator from Denver, and I am a big, huge fan of tabletop role-playing games and have been since the early 80s.
All right, Bill.
Hi there, I'm Bill Keyes, also known as the Bunny. I've been gaming since the early 80s, so for way too long, and I've been in the game industry since about 2005. Right now I'm the director of production for Evil Beagle Games, alongside Chaz and my other friends here.
All right, Micheal, you're up.
My name is Micheal Surbrook. I first started gaming in 1977 and have been creating game content part-time professionally since the late 90s, about 98 or 99. I also am one of the lead designers and content creators for Evil Beagle Games.
And then we also have Pigeon.
Yes, hey, I am teach political science at Colorado State University. As far as I know, I'm the only political scientist in the world that studies the politics of game worlds. I even once taught a course on the politics of science fiction and fantasy worlds at the Air Force Academy, which was a lot of fun. I've been working with Evil Beagle Games to support world building efforts and also game master for their Prowlers and Paragon setting.
All right. We are going to start with Bill's 3 rules for game mastering.
I can't really take credit for this because it comes from a lot of different places, but I sort of codified 3 laws that I think all game masters need to keep in mind when they're running a game. And the first one is you shall create fun, or through inaction, allow fun to be had. And then the second rule is you shall promote and nurture the narrative and simulation of your shared gaming experience, as long as such promotion does not conflict with the first law. And the third law is you shall obey the dice and the rule book, except where such results would conflict with the first and second law. Of course, there's a sort of a parody of the Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, but I think they're super important to keep in mind that the first law is for everybody to have fun. The second law is, of course, to build a shared world and a shared experience together. And the third law, I think the least important law, but still important, is that you should obey the dice and the rules, except when that would conflict with the first 2 rules.
Definitely. Anybody have anything they want to add to that or bounce springboard off of?
Sure. In regards to obeying the dice, I think a good quality for a GM to have is, even if you roll a critical and the party's been kind of getting their butts handed to them throughout the combat, and you roll a critical, you don't always have to take it. You don't have to say, oh no, that was, must obey the dice, so I guess, it's a TPK, total party kill. Sorry guys. Because, even though you are being honest with the fact that you rolled, 3 criticals in a row, the players probably aren't going to have a good time. And I think that's pretty paramount.
I think one of the first rules of game mastering that I keep reading is use the dice only when there's a chance of failure.
Yeah, that actually
only when failure is interesting.
I would actually say that, yeah, there are times where you yourself don't need to roll the dice. The players don't need to roll the dice. A great example of this is a story that we call the Tarzan Moment, where in the middle of a pulp game, a earthquake machine was activated in Central Park, and it proceeded to shake New York to its foundations. And the guy playing Tarzan said, "Well, I'm going to jump out the window, go down the fire escape, running along the telephone wires, and that's my action." And the player said, "Okay," or the GM said, "Okay." And another player said, "Well, doesn't he have to make an agility tech?" And the GM's reply was, "Dude, he's Tarzan. Tarzan's whole shtick or motif in a game is his strength and agility from growing up among apes. So if your player is doing something that fits their niche, the strong man is going to bend a bar, the thief is going to pick a lock, and failure makes them look stupid and has no impact on gameplay. There's no time limit to pick that lock. Picking that lock lets you give the players clues that you want to give them. Then it should be, yeah, you do it. You don't have to roll the dice because why bother? It advances the story, and if it's something the player can look really cool doing it, then it makes the character seem that that's what they do.
Yeah, and like I was said earlier, is that I only, as a game master, I only roll the dice, or I only ask the players to roll the dice when failure is just as interesting or even more interesting than success would be. So if you have your player searching a room to find a clue, and you make them make a perception roll and nobody makes the perception roll, then the game grinds to a halt, and that's not fun for anybody. So the only time that I would make them roll is if failure is more interesting than them actually finding the clue, or them actually, being able to pick the lock or whatever.
Okay, that was really good. Pigeon, you wanted to talk about world building a little bit.
I did. Um, and I'm somewhat taking a page as well from Sean Patrick Fannin, who's listening in, president of Evil Beagle Games. Basically, what I call the balance between realism and believability, and what Big Irish would call verisimilitude. When I say realism versus believability, to repeat, I study politics in game worlds. I've taught a course on the politics of game worlds. And if I'm doing in-class analysis, trying to teach students how to use these tools, these theories, like constructivism, realism, or liberalism, we want to be accurate. So we'll tear apart a world. We'll say, if you use these theories at face value, a world like the Forgotten Realms doesn't hold water. But now that's the realism side. If you want to do the believable side, that's where the fun is. That's where the world's consistent. That's where you suspend your disbelief. That's where now I can walk into the Forgotten Realms and everything just works. I understand the people, the politics, the trade routes, the sea routes, and everything comes together. And maybe tying also into the 3 rules of GMs, it's you want to have believability win out almost all the time when it comes to world building. Now I'll turn it over to my compatriots.
Chaz, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah. Well, actually, not really. I think Pigeon pretty much hit it on the head, in my opinion, in that, creating a believable world is fantastic. Obviously, there are some things that you wanna kind of make realistic, but overall, for me anyway, as a GM, I try to put that realism in how the NPCs react, how they operate, their motivations and things like that, because I like to do a lot of role playing. So I want to make sure that they are reacting somewhat realistically. So if a player walks up and says, "Okay, I'm going to walk up to the guard and just slap them really hard in the face," I don't just sit there and have them go, "Oh, okay," I have them actually react to that and probably arrest the player as well, because that's realistic. So yeah, but I definitely agree, absolutely wholeheartedly.
Okay, Bill, anything to add, or?
I mean, this is just it's kind of, I think what Pigeon is talking about is a little bit like the rule of cool, where even if it's not realistic, for someone to do something like, if you watch the John Wick movies, for instance, it's not really realistic for him to be able to walk through a hail of bullets and kill 30 guys at a time, but it is super cool. And I think that's something that we like to do in gaming, is to be cool, for the players to be able to do super cool things, whether they're realistic or not, as long as it is all within the boundaries of the rules of the world that you've set up.
Thank you. Michael, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I wanted to actually capitalize on something Bill just said, the rules of the world that you set up. There is a place for worlds that are realistic. If you're playing in a historical setting, Sengoku era Japan, the English Civil War, the American Revolution, World War I, whatever, there's a certain level of realism that you want to adhere to, or else you're starting to wonder exactly what world am I in. As anybody can tell you, if you watch The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, you have no idea, other than that's supposed to be during the Civil War, where it takes place, because they say they're in Georgia and then they wander into a desert. You're like, that's a little odd, but you don't care because you're watching a really cool Western. But there is a place for impossible worlds. Bill famously has his world, which is a mile on a side, has 1 million people in it, and one end of it overlooks a bottomless chasm. And if a player asks, "How does this work?" you reply with "Roll for initiative." Yeah. But you also have to understand, getting into this, and tell your players, this is the world it's going to be. And there are times where you can present players with perfectly realistic things. They're going to be like, "That's absurd. Nobody ever did that. Want to bet?" It's in history. So going into your setting, you have to make the players aware of where the weirdness starts. Yes, this is World War I, but guess what? There are werewolves and vampires on the battlefield. Yes, this is the year 2030, and the United States is fragmented and broken apart, and there's people who can stop tank shells with their minds because they did these crazy experiments in the 50s, like you saw in Stranger Things. So you need to know going in that the world is realistic, but.
And I think that's oh, go ahead, Pigeon.
I was going to throw in one last thing. One of my favorite illustrations I like to use when I'm teaching class. I even use this in my real world political science class to make a point. What's one thing people think of when they role play? We want to think about narrative, we want to think about story, but also the loot. Let's admit it, the loot. Getting that shiny sword, that +2 something of something, and the piles of gold. But as I tell my students, if I was looking at it from a purely realistic standpoint, think of the Hobbit movies, or the book, but think of the Hobbit movies. So whatever you thought of the movies, just think of the acres and acres of gold that are in Smaug's lair. In real human history, we have only discovered enough gold to fill 2.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So that amount of gold in the actual movie, from a purely realistic standpoint, would probably it would be worthless. It would destroy the global economy, because that would probably be more gold than was actually in existence. But I'm like, you know what? Forget about that. Forget about that. We were here for the story. So I want my players want to have that moment where they're bathing in bathtubs full of rubies and gemstones, because they have that sense of achievement, that I've conquered the foozle and I've won the prize. Let me enjoy the prize. And I will, again, going back to what I say, realism is believable. I'll let it be believable. They can enjoy their prize. Now I'll step away again.
Great. And I think what Michael was saying, I think springboards really well into the session 0. And Bill, you brought this one up, so I'll let you start on this.
Sure. A session 0 is pretty simple. It's a session where the game master and the players get together before the game actually starts, and they talk about what they want the game to be. And you can talk about not just the basic stuff like, we want to play 5th edition D&D, or we want to play Prowlers and Paragons, or we want to play whatever game that it is that you're playing, but you also set expectations like, I want this to be a game in which heroism is rewarded, where doing the right thing doesn't cost me, isn't punished by the universe. Or I want a game in which we are outlaws, and the powers that be, the authorities, are bad guys, and we have to stand against them. And everybody kind of discusses what they'd like to see in the game, and they reach a consensus as to what kind of game it's going to be. And you can set up things like how deadly is the game going to be, how much loot there's going to be, bouncing off what Pigeon said, things like that, how common magic is, whether there's religious persecution, things like that. You can kind of build the world together, build the game together, and it sets up the expectations for everybody ahead of time.
And it's also really does set the tone of the types of characters. And so you come together as a group to begin with without having to meet in that tavern and, oh, I see you're wearing the PC t-shirt, so you must be trustworthy. Micheal.
So actually this ties, I'm going to use an example of a session 0 that I ran, which was, I was going to run Curse of Strahd. If anybody knows anything about Curse of Strahd, you know that's something that's probably going to require a session 0 because I want to explain what it is I'm running. Sure, it's a module, but it's going to be Gothic Horror. What do I mean by Gothic Horror? What happens if you die? I take you to the next room and say, do you want to be dead? Because I can bring you back. You may not want to be brought back, but this is part of the setting. This is D&D, so if you roll a 1, that means one thing in combat, it means another thing in skills, and so on. But one of the most important things with this and any other game was, how do you know each other? I don't want this absurd, we all meet in the tavern and just randomly decide to adventure, because in Curse of Strahd, especially, the group dynamic is super important, because it's pretty much you and nobody else. So one of the questions to ask, and this is good for any game, how do you know each other? How did you meet? How much history do you have? Why are you together? What are you doing? And that can help establish, as session 0, the players can play off each other and be like, oh, well, I am this person. Oh, then I met you at this point. We know each other. Oh, good. Then I can be this. And in this game, somebody wanted to be a paladin, and the wizard became, he is my wizard, she is my wizard, the rogue is my spy master, the bard is my herald, and so on and so on and so on. And they fit themselves together as a group before we even started play.
We had a comment in the chat. Another question to answer is, will you be on your own, or will you have a patron organization? So, are you free agents, or are you part of a bigger organization? I think that's also a really good thing to consider. Chaz, you have anything to add?
No, I think session 0s are very cool and very important if you can get everyone together. Sometimes players just want to just jump right in the session 0, in my experience anyway, usually ends up just being the first adventure, because everyone is like, hey, we want to play this system and we want to just kind of dive into it. And so the session 0 may take about an hour, and then for the next 5-6 hours or so, we're just playing into the first adventure. So I tried a session 0 where I didn't have anything planned, and because everybody just wanted to jump in and play, I was like, yeah, let me just improv for a while. So then after that, I just decided I'm going to have the first couple of sessions already planned out, and that way, if people just want to kind of jump right in, I'm ready for it. So.
Okay, we have a comment, and then we're going to have a question. The comment is, session 0s are also good for players and GMs to state X card concepts. In other words, those things that are kind of uncomfortable for each other. And then our question we have is, what about when folks have different desires expressed in session 0? Before the PCs are introduced to each other, one wants a grim and gritty, another wants good will triumph. How do you handle that? Any takers on this one?
You can do it like Batman. Batman is pretty grim and gritty, and yet he's very heroic. There's also Thieves' World as well. That kind of setting where the where the setting itself is very, very grim, maybe even a little low fantasy, but the players themselves can be the exception in that they are powerful enough to be good people even when all hope is gone for the populace. And maybe they are the heroes that bring hope and morality back to this really sad, gray, worn down populace.
Yeah, and that's a game world that I'm writing and hopefully will get published in 2021, called Blood and Justice. That's exactly what that's about, is that it is a grim world where hope seems lost, but the heroes are supposed to be the ones who can stand up against the corruption and hopefully at some point bring it into it. And so that's a good way to compromise. And we've got a comment that says negotiate, and that's a great idea, is always communicate with the players and the GMs and with each other, and find out where the compromise can be. Where is it? Where's the halfway point between grim and gritty, and good will always triumph.
I also think there's. Oh,
go ahead, Mike.
I think the second line to that comment is also very important. I think there has to be an understanding that not every game is for every person. I personally know if I said I was going to run Call of Cthulhu, there's people in my social circle will be like, "That's not for me. Shadowrun's not for me," and everybody has to agree with that. This is why you have to be upfront even before session 0. This is what I want to run. This is the story I want to tell, and such. And people have to be like, okay, I'll find a different game. I mean, there was a point where somebody says, I'm going to run Giant Mechs. And I'm like, I'm not in the Giant Mechs. I'll figure something else out while you play that scenario for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, go ahead, Pigeon, sorry.
Oh, I was going to link Arne's and Michael's the question and comment together with a particular problem. The idea that you're at a convention, so you don't have time for a session 0. You're basically doing a round 0. The players have just sat down, and you're going to start. So how do I then set the expectations right away there? Part of it begins for me just with the narrative I use in describing my game in the panel, in the schedule, where I use keywords like action-oriented or slapstick or something to give them the potential players who sign up a feel of what to expect. Also, though, when they sit down before we start, I just say I'm going to tell them who I am, and this is how I run my table. This is what that behavior I like to see, and what you can expect from me. And just try to lay it out very honestly, and boldly, and efficiently. And that method has never let me down.
Okay.
I've had a good time.
And then, sorry, Pigeon, we do have a comment that you're being a little bit quiet. So.
What? Oh.
And then we have another question. Have any of you had a session 0 and had the players realize that the group is not a good fit? And I think this kind of bounces off of Chaz wanted to talk about that not all game mastering styles fit all players, and all players don't fit a game master style. So we'll start off with Chaz.
Yeah, you do sometimes. Hopefully it doesn't happen to you very often. But you do find that sometimes if players are being honest about the kinds of games that they like, or the kinds of GM that they want, or that kind of thing, if everyone's being honest, then as Michael said, it's perfectly fine for someone to say, hey, I really like you guys a lot, but I'm bowing out of this because I'm just not into this type of game. There are some GMs like myself who I'm very, very role play heavy. And if you're the type of player that says, I just want to kill it, take its stuff, go to the next room, I want to be in dungeons, I don't want to see the outside world for months, I want us to just get the loot, and I'll buy more stuff and better stuff and then go back into the next dungeon. And it's like, okay, well, that's not the kind of game that I want to run. Therefore, may I suggest this kind of GM or that GM or this guy over here who's running a game? And that's perfectly cool. There's no hard feelings, but the goal of the GM is for everyone to have fun. So if you find that if you're the odd person out and everyone else wants to play a grim, gritty Batman type of game, but you want something that's more like Robin Hood or King Arthur or something like that, something more fairy tale-esque, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you may just have to find a different group. So, yeah.
Or just sit out that one particular game. You know, if the game is going to last 6 months or whatever, then maybe just sit it out.
And that's actually what I did. I sat out that game and I found some other people and I ran a game for them and they really enjoyed it. We all had fun.
Yeah, and I know one person in our gaming group is not really into superhero genre. So, whenever that comes into our rotation, he's doing other things. And, that's perfectly fine. We know that when we get back to D&D, hack and slash, he's right there. And so I think that's really good. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, and you can also use that time if you're not playing in the game. You can use that time to prep your game, come up with your idea. That you're like, I don't want to play a grim and gritty game. I want to play a high fantasy, Robin Hood type game. Then use that time that you're not playing to come up with your own ideas, so that next time a slot opens up, then you're ready for it.
Mm-hmm. Good. So I'm going to pose this question to everybody, and I'm going to start with Chaz. What is the Game Master's role in the gaming session?
In my opinion, the Game Master's role in the gaming session is for the players to have a fantastic time. In a way, my overriding philosophy is that however it happens, the players should win. I don't have to make it easy for them. I don't have to make it, so bloody difficult that when they're fighting that group of goblins, it's a session that lasts for 3 or 4 weeks or something. But I'm not going to hand it to them. But I know in the back of my mind that at some point towards the end, they're gonna win. Because that's the point. They're playing heroes. Heroes get to win. Nobody wants to read a story or watch a television show where the heroes are just doing nothing but getting their butts handed to them week after week after week. After a while, nobody's going to watch that show. Nobody's going to read that book because it's like, well, the heroes lose. What's the point? Evil wins. Ooh, So the players will get to win. That's my overriding thing. So for me, if they're having a great time along the way, and there's some challenges and maybe there's some fumbles happening or whatever, awesome. That just adds to the adventure, that adds to the storytelling. So to me, that's where the thrill of the game is.
Great. Pigeon?
Largely seconding Chaz. I see that I'm there to help the players create their narrative. Have the players basically create the world with me. I present them the map with some key locations, but they're telling the story. I want to be there to to adjudicate, to referee, to keep the game running smoothly, prevent personal conflicts from breaking out on the table, and just make it a smooth running, enjoyable game.
Great. Bill?
I don't really have a whole lot to add to what Chaz said. I think it's what he said is really, really important. But one thing I would add is that the game master himself or herself is also a player at the table, and should also be having fun. Then that's actually going to spill out to the rest of the table, and the players are going to feel that. They're going to feel that lack of emotional intensity, and they're going to start dragging as well. So always make sure that you as a game master are also enjoying it.
Mm-hmm. Micheal?
I think a GM in any game, if you're running the game, then you have a story you want to tell. The players are part of that story. You want the players to experience that story, and you want the players to take that story and run with it. So the role is to present the story, the world, the NPCs, to listen to what the players are saying, to work with them, make sure everybody gets their separate FaceTime, everybody gets to interact, everybody gets to work with the story the way they want to, and to try to do things fairly, make sure everybody has a chance to talk, interact, get to express themselves and let their characters do what they want their characters to do, while you also enjoy yourself by presenting your story elements that you want to present, and the NPCs you want to present, and the difficulties and trials and hurdles and everything else.
Okay, we have a comment and then we have a question. So I'm going to read the comment first. I think the GM is there to inspire, to give indication of important things to be done in the world, not just sit there and wait to see what the players do. And then our question is, how would you handle a game where the players are taking the narrative or plot in a direction that you're uncomfortable or uninterested in running? Ooh, that's a tough one. Who wants to take that one?
I think there is a point where you have to say, if the player could give you an X card and says, well, that's a direction I'm not comfortable with, you as GM should be able to turn around and say, that's a direction I'm not comfortable with.
Yeah, I think it depends on what uncomfortable means also. Like if the player is doing something really squicky that you just don't want to have in your game, like if they're like, well, I'm going to torture this guy, and you're like, I just don't want to deal with that in my game. You could do something like a fade to black, okay, you do that and you get this information, or you can pull the player aside and say, let's not go in this direction because I don't really want this to be that kind of game. But yeah, I mean, communication between the player and the GM is always important. So even as a GM, you can take a player aside and say, let's not go in this direction. I think that would be the best idea.
I think sometimes too, with something like that, and again, it depends on the direction, which is why I think improv is really a very important skill for a GM to have, so that you could kind of go with whatever the players are doing. But there should still, I feel, be guardrails to say, if this is not the kind of world that everyone agreed to, like if you want high fantasy where everyone's heroic and you've got one character that says, well, I want to torture this guy, that's when you say, okay, keep in mind, if you do, and it gets out that that's what you guys do to people that you capture, you are going to start getting a really horrible reputation. And if you want to risk that, let me know. Otherwise, you may want to make a separate choice, because sometimes it comes down to saying the player may go, well, I didn't know whether that was okay in your world or not. And in which case you say, well, the evil villains do that. The heroes generally don't. So you get to make a choice. But I'm letting you know before you do your action. So I think sometimes that's really important too, is to give players that whole, okay, before you do X, here are the ramifications, the possible ramifications of your action. Do you still wish to do this? And if they do, then I go with it. And then the players at that point know I chose to do X and I was willing to take whatever consequences come my way. In which case I could turn it into a completely different game, but at least they know what you just did is kind of a no-no here. So
yeah, I think that's the famous GM line of, are you sure you want to do that?
as a rolling dice going,
And I think that leads really good into another GM hard spot is, how do you handle those problem players, those players who really don't either mesh with the group or want to steamroll their version of the game? What's a good method for handling that? And whoever raises their hand first gets to go first. Bill.
This happened to me once in a convention game in which I was running. Essentially, it was sort of an Aladdin type world in which it was very high fantasy, Arabian Nights, magic, and that sort of thing. And one of the characters was playing the world's greatest thief, and he was supposed to be this Aladdin type character who would, he would steal a loaf of bread, but then he would turn around and give it to the orphans on the corner. But this player saw that he was the world's greatest thief and decided that meant he had to steal everything, and he had to steal from the party, and he had to try to steal the princess's jewels and all this other stuff. And we took a 5-minute break at some point early in the game, and I pulled him aside and I talked to him about it. And I said, I don't want to tell you how to play your character. I don't want to tell you that you're playing it wrong, but this is the kind of game it is in which you are a hero, in which you are trying to fight for the underdog. Not that you're trying to steal a bunch of jewels and get rich or anything, but you're trying to make the world a better place. And after I took him aside and after I had that conversation with him, he was a model player pretty much after that. He was a younger guy, and I think he had only ever played, hack and slash dungeon crawls. And so he just didn't really understand the rules of the genre. So having that open communication with him really helped.
I know that I was in a game, not as GM, where the GM had to call a halt to the game and take somebody. He admits later he didn't do it right, but what he should have done was taken the guy aside and said, you can't be cracking jokes about everything I say. You can't start being snarky. You can't, you are disrupting it for everybody else. Because at the time I lived in Maryland. I'm like, I came 1,700 miles by plane to come to Denver to play in this game. And this guy's mocking everything that's going on. It was a point of, you can, at least a convention, certainly, because you don't know always who you're playing with. The GM should have the right to ask somebody to leave. If he's rooting it for 5 or 6 other people, he or she or they, I think there's a point where the GM could say, this isn't working and you should go. And the same goes for home games. If you know everybody for years, odds are this won't happen. But if a friend of a friend shows up, there is a good chance where you may have to say, look, the guy's looking up, this person's looking up stuff in the monster manual. They are on their phone. They are talking over me. They do sketchy stuff with their dice, whatever. There is a point where you have to say, look, I'm afraid you're going to have to leave. And I think you have to be willing to do that. I think there is an idea that I'm 1977, you played D&D, you're an outcast. So all us outcasts have to stick together. But there is a point where you have to say, no, you're not being fair to the rest of us. And the social stigma is much more gone. With Critical Role and everything, not saying that there's a billion other players out there, but you have to acknowledge now that their behavior can be harmful to you and your other players, and you have to acknowledge that.
I agree. It's one of those things where, like, I've had a couple of times, I've had situations where a player was essentially stealing focus. They were essentially hijacking the game, and we had 5 other players, but that one player was trying to make it all about them. They were basically chaotic everywhere. They, anytime anybody was doing anything in any room where they weren't, they had to somehow magically be involved in everything that was going on. Fear of missing out, whatever you want to call it. And so sometimes as a GM, you can institute a way of GMing that limits that. Like, for instance, going around the table and asking everybody what they're doing. And that inadvertently gives everyone the chance to have the spotlight, at least for a little bit, so that everybody feels like they can be involved, and that prevents another player from just hijacking the game. Other times you have to be rather firm and say, I'm sorry, you said you were over there checking the chest. I'll get right back to you on that. Meanwhile, while he is doing this, what are you doing? And that's a good indication to the player that wants to just kind of be everywhere and be involved in everything, to say, oh, other people are doing things while I'm doing this, and he's going to attend to them first and then get back to me. Okay, great. It doesn't always work, but it could be a good way to make sure that everybody's voices get heard, make sure everyone gets to participate, and you could theoretically be training that player to be a better, table participant, as it were.
Pigeon, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I do. I actually want to take a line off of Bill Keyes, the idea, pulling someone aside, or I'll call it the importance of pulling someone aside. If you look at game theorists like Huizinga and Sutton Smith and Kewa will say basically when you're playing at the table is basically a temple. It becomes a ritual space. So when you're inside there playing it, that's the world for the players. So if I come down and punish somebody at the table and it breaks the disbelief, it basically desanctifies the temple. So also coming from my military background, the idea of praising in public and punishing in private. Don't embarrass someone at the table if you don't have to. In that case, I've always found a lot of luck in just saying, hey, let's take a break, everyone gets something to eat. Now you're basically walking out of the temple, and then you pull that player aside and talk to them, debrief them. And then when you come back to the table, you're all basically backing into the temple again. Also, I would see it's important to debrief also at the end of the session, kind of say, as you're what's called memorializing the event, coming out of it, what do you think went well? What do you think it didn't well? And this would allow people to decompress, and they might be more likely to come out and say, well, I thought your character, as opposed to pointing fingers at the player, your character was making my character uncomfortable. And it's a good way that you basically take lessons learned out of it, leave the ego and the mistakes behind. And then when you come back to the next game, you're playing fresh.
Yeah. Somebody commented that spotlight control is a good skill for a GM to have. And then bouncing off what Pigeon said, I know in one game we played in, before we left the game, it was like everybody got to answer, what did you like about the game? What could be improved? What was the highlight that somebody else did? And there was a fourth question now, I can't remember what it was, but everybody got a chance to give that feedback, not only to the other players, but to the game master. And so I think the main thing that we're pretty much pounding here is communicate. That open dialogue is so important. We were also going to talk about honoring character agency. And again, this came up with, okay, the players want to go in direction A, but I'm not sure I want to go into that. Who wants to take that?
I can. Oh, go ahead, Pigeon. Go for it.
Yeah. This is the concept of agency, you're going to see that in actual social science and also gaming. And, basically agency being how much change a person can affect on their environment. So in a high agency environment, people can affect change. Low agency, basically no matter what they do, nothing happens around them. Nothing changes. So it builds hopelessness. When it comes to the gaming environment, if you really want to create powerful motivators for your players, actually change parts of the world based on what your players do. And I would call it both exponential agency and escalating agency, i.e. the first level character, saves the cat from the tree. That's going to make someone happy in the town, a single person. But that starts a relationship. They start building up levels, and now 10th level character saves the prince. That fundamentally changes the political ramifications between two different kingdoms in your world. Now, it doesn't necessarily always have to be huggable and touchy-feely. We want to think that, yes, I'm heroic, I'm doing something good, but also in a good game, honestly, consequences have to matter in the opposite end. The higher level they are, the bigger of a mistake they make, the greater the ramification is. Now the narrative is how are they going to get themselves out of that pickle? And I see some hands up here, so I'll turn it over.
Well, Tammy said that this actually ties into what I wanted to talk about, and I have a couple examples I want to bring up. By the way, anybody watching this, I'm suffering a massive allergy attack. hence a couple of times while I've turned the video off so you don't watch me sneeze. What this ties into is a concept of player agency called Players Write the Best Adventures. And I'm going to actually, this is some examples of things I've seen in game, I participated in, or have happened to me. And these examples will illustrate what I mean by Players Write the Best Adventures. Initially, though, you have to realize the GM is trying to tell a story. We're going to play D&D, and I want you guys to fight monsters or rob tombs or whatever. We're going to be superheroes. So the GM often has a story or adventure he wants to tell because he's presenting something for the world for the players to engage in. But at times, the players will do things that the GM can capitalize on that can help him expand the story. So Pigeon's example of at first level, you did something. I was in a game called Shadows Angeles where we were all paranormally, supernaturally powered cops fighting Lovecraftian monsters in a future city. And at one point, my character, using an enchanted knife, cut open a vending machine and just handed out stuff to people who had survived a riot. And then much further on, we were all declared outlaws. And the player and the GM said, well, you, talking to me, and you, talking to the party paladin, you guys are actually fine. You, pointing to another character, have been a jerk to everybody through the entire game. You're in trouble if they actually get their hands on you. And we're like, oh. So the game had consequences. Things we did early on either helped or hindered us further down the line. And that's an example of taking what the players do, applying it to the world, which is things that we've talked about in various degrees, and allowing the players to affect the world and the world to affect them. Now going more directly into players writing the best adventures, I was in a Teen Supers game. One of the players was playing an alien sent to Earth to learn humility, very much like Thor. And my mom was an alien, my dad was human, so I was kind of like Star-Lord. And I'm running around. And at one point, we have defeated a supervillain, and I looked to the player playing the alien sent to Earth and said, you know the difference between your family and mine? Mine's never tried to take over the world. Meanwhile, the GM takes his pen, takes his pad, writes down some notes, and a couple adventures later, I was sent back in time to World War II. Everybody else played a new character. I played my character, and I found out that my mother's brother, my uncle, was cooperating with the Nazis to take over the world. And the GM was very blatant about, yeah, you basically had me come up with that concept for the game. And then the third example was that I was running Curse of Strahd, and I had seen that hags can have certain lair actions. So I told a player that he sees the rotted corpse of his grandfather in ancient rusting plate armor, who was soundlessly haranguing him and such. And the player said, oh, I guess I'm haunted by the ghost of my grandfather. And I took my notebook and went, you are now. So every other time in the game where a ghost or a reflection or something would pop up, that's what he got hit with. And in all cases, you're taking things that the players are saying, things they may say idly, things they may say out of turn, things they say, I wish, I want, or other elements, and you make a note of it, and you figure out how you can turn that into something that they will have to deal with in a session or two or further down the line.
Yeah.
All right, Bill, you wanted to say something?
I was going to say that the player's agency doesn't have to be so broad and so large as to affect the entire world. You can build a connection between the players and the characters and just a small village, for example, or a castle, or even just a family. And the characters can affect a small part of the world and still walk away from it feeling like they've done something good. So you don't have to save the whole world. You can just save a single person, and that can be very meaningful as well.
That's the starfish parable.
Yes, I like the starfish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we had a question. How often have you all changed your intended narrative or meta plot because you liked an idea that the players came up with? Any examples? We didn't necessarily change a meta plot, but we derailed a whole session one time because it was a character's birthday, and we spent the whole session celebrating that character's birthday and planning the big party. It just means that the bad guys got up one step ahead of us. But anybody else have any other examples? Or
I don't have any specific examples per se, just because my wife is behind me and she plays in my game, so I can't give away too many secrets. However, there are, I think most players, most GMs will eventually run into situations like that. And so, to directly answer your question, I think it's important to have an outline for where you want the game to go in a story, because you don't want the players sitting around going, what do we do? What is there to do in this world? So you want to give them a good start and give them a good setting and say, this is kind of what's going on here, blah, blah, blah. And maybe start them off on an adventure. And then knowing that the players are going to have things that they want to do throughout all of that. And you have to give yourself a lot of room to be able to improvise so that you can tailor parts of the game to what the players are interested in. Because if they're just constantly playing a game that they have no agency in, that doesn't cater to what they want to do specifically, they're not gonna have as much fun. It's like I saw it in a Dragon magazine once, I think a long time ago, where the players are like, the GM is like, well, there's a river to the east, and to the west there's this really ancient looking castle with glowing windows, and the players are like, okay, we let's go north. And the GM is like, there are mountains to the north, you can't go north. Okay, we go south. Oh, the south is just this endless desert, and it's super hot there, and you'll die within the first like 3 steps. Okay, let's go to the west. There's that ocean over there, and you can't cross the ocean. Okay, fine, we go east. So you can't. That's not a very interesting game for the players. So
Yeah. I was in a Shadowrun game one time, and we were playing from a module. And I think this is one of the bad things from a module. And our job as the runners was to go, Mr. Johnson had hired us to go get the MacGuffin. Well, we got the MacGuffin, we brought it back, and Mr. Johnson was dead. And so we're like, we have this MacGuffin, what are we supposed to do with it? And so this other group showed up and said, give us the MacGuffin. And we said, okay, pay us whatever Mr. Johnson was going to pay us, and here's the MacGuffin. And the game master was, you did what? And so he had to kind of rewrite the module to get us back on track to what we were supposed to be doing. Flexibility, I think, is a really good thing. And improv.
I know, if I remember correctly, in one game I was running, the players had encountered this sort of bizarre, omnipotent being that could open doorways to anywhere, and they said, and they said, can you open a door to location X? And I was like, I hadn't thought of that. But sure, because if you go to location X, we can go to the boss battle next session. So, you guys went right. It looks like we're going to skip this more build up, and you're going to go right to the climatic final scene. And they were like, great. Wait a minute.
Yeah. All right, you show up in Mount Doom. I drop the ring. Yay! Okay.
Who's running next week?
Yeah.
Oh no, it wasn't. It was more like, congratulations, you now have to deal with the spirit of murder who has been undermining you all game. And because it was a short game and I felt free to kill off a PC, one of the PCs actually didn't make it out of that fight, but he was like, that was a cool way to go.
Yeah. Okay, we are down to our last 5 minutes. If there are any questions, now is the time to answer them. If not, we're going to do just final remarks. So if anybody has a question, now's the time to ask it.
Looks like final remarks time.
It looks like final remarks time. We're going to start with Micheal. Oh, hold on. What are your techniques for reading a table? That's a good question.
Are we talking graph or?
I think he means how do you tell if a table is having fun or losing interest? How can you tell that? And if
I think make eye contact, the going around the table part. If people are stacking dice or looking at their phones, then I think it's time to say, okay, let's have a transition scene or a scene change and move on. Because having watched some streams, you can tell where like you can see other players getting bored because only one or two characters are either talk to each other. The GM, you're like, yeah, that conversation's gone on way far enough. You're not just, and you're talking in circles, and you should often admit, guys, I think this is going in circles. We're going to establish. Let's change the scene and let's move on, and let's get to the next bit, and then people will often get into. We'll get back into the game because now the focus they can get some spotlight time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think the going around the table bit is a good way to keep players from being bored. And it's a good way to keep everyone involved, because I think that's, for me anyway, that's been my experience, is that if everyone feels like they're engaged or they could get called on at any time, then people tend to pay a lot more attention to the game. But if one player is hijacking the spotlight and the GM is basically talking with them for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, going back and forth in this great role-playing thing, and no one else is involved, then your players are going to get bored. So just kind of keep that in mind a little bit. Have your NPCs, even if they're having a one-on-one conversation with a player, have your NPC start focusing on some of the other players as well to keep them involved in the conversation.
Michael?
So actually, I'll throw something out real quick that I did Thursday night. Or sorry, Friday night. Friday night, I was going to have the players meet a bunch of NPCs. And this is a technique which I was given some thumbs up by some people, including Sean. I created an NPC for each player, asked them to pick the one they liked. And they played the NPCs talking to the NPC played by me, so that they could learn about the players could by just listening to the characters interact with each other. And so I didn't just talk to myself or just read off exposition and moss. The players understood what the new plot development was through playing NPCs that had enough role-playing information that they understood what the point was. And by each NPC having different information and thoughts, they could talk to each other and me as playing a seventh NPC, and therefore get something going that would keep them interested, keep them engaged in the game, so they're not just sitting there, like I said, listening to me espouse and yammer. And I was told
actually a really good idea.
And a couple of at least one or two players are like, I've got to try that. That's a great way to keep the game flow going and everybody interested in the game and involved in the game while establishing a new plot element.
All right. We are 1 minute, so I'd like to thank Fort Collins Comic Con for having us here. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Chaz, Pigeon, Bill, Michael. And just as a plug, we are considering doing more of these on an Evil Beagle channel, so stay tuned and we can maybe cover some other topics and go in depth for the ones that you have questions on. And again, thank you all for joining us. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Follow Evil Beagle Games on Facebook.
I'm on Twitter. I talk about gaming.
All right. Yep, www.evilbeaglegames.com. You can find us all there.
All right.
All right.
Great chat, everybody. Thank